Good morning. Good morning. Knowing God, the attributes of God and how they speak to our lives. So we're looking at an attribute which is something true about God that we can only begin to imagine that He's revealed Himself. If He didn't communicate Himself, we'd know something about Him through His created order, wouldn't we? What would you know about Him from the creation itself if there was no special revelation? In other words, the two ways of knowing are empiricism and rationalism, through our senses and through our thinking. So what would you know about God? You would learn about His awesome power, yes. So you'd learn about the whole idea of the creation. So again, when you're looking at the glory of God and the created order, we would see something about Him that is just stunning. We can't help but notice, but these are things to remember, that many of these things we're privileged to see that were never known by the biblical authors. You're looking at something, they had no clue that you're seeing the structure of the sun here. This is a prominence, and this grainy surface. It's so complex, it's incredible. The more we learn about it, the more mysterious it becomes. So we're seeing many things about the living God that they could know, but many things that they did not know that we're privileged to see. And when we see that, I mean, these cuttlefish are incredible. But the point is that we see a creative God, one who is beyond our imagination. And it tells us His eternal power and divine nature. What does it say in Romans 1? Been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. And then he goes on to say, so that they are without excuse. No one will be able to appear before the living God and say, you didn't show me any evidence, as Richard Dawkins actually arrogantly claimed, if there was a God like that. The evidence we'll see will have been right in front of us. But what we could not learn about God is revealed in the third way of knowing, and that third way of knowing is not through His creation itself, although we can learn so much about Him. I mean, this is wild. I mean, His imagination and creativity is boggling my imagination. The more I'm looking at it, the more I'm stunned and marvel. I mean, this is just an African daisy. I took this photo in England, in Sissinghurst. I still remember that. It was just the first time I'd seen one. And when we look at His creative order, then we know that this was one who is His power, His majesty, the mind of the maker is awesome. But we could never know that the one who made all this is also the lover of your souls. You could not know that the one who holds the galaxies together is also the one who became one with us. The whole thing is beyond imagination. What was it in us that warranted that? And we really ask that question because there's nothing in us that really could merit that or achieve it or attain it. We've been talking about, though, the various components about the attributes of God. And on our last time together, we looked at a couple of them. We were looking at the wisdom of God, and we didn't get beyond that. So I saved the transcendence for today. So we're going to talk about His transcendence, which means He's beyond our imagination. You can't really comprehend Him. But He's also immanent, and the other side of that coin is that He's close to us as well. And you've seen me use this chart a lot of times to help us recognize that we must get our arms around the fact that He's both near and far, that He's both intimate and infinite, and that Jesus, because of His solidarity with our condition, becoming one with us, this means, therefore, that we can know Him in a way that is beyond imagination, that you are in Him and He is in you. So talk about intimacy, a mutual indwelling is as intimate as you can get. And yet, at the same time, the one who indwells us is terrifyingly beyond our imaginations. We have to keep that in mind. To have a biblical perspective, then, is to see both the fear of God and the love of God, to see the entire range of His majesty and holiness and awe, but at the same time to recognize the intimacy and the joy that we can have of knowing Him and being comforted. This is a very powerful thing. And so this is why when we talk about Him, then we marvel at His greatness. So I'm going to talk about His transcendence first. And before I do that, though, Dennis mentioned these cards. And so I want to go back to the spiritual renewal cards just for a minute, because he was mentioning these spiritual renewal cards. And I want to just encourage you, because you're getting these for free. After all, what's wrong with coming up and taking one for free? I'm hoping that you're using this one before you go to bed, before you get up in the morning. Because I can't help it now. You see, your true nature is habituated, what you do by habit. And so you form excellence by habituation, and it becomes a part of what we are. And even before you mentioned this green card, I had I shot up a prayer again this morning in my speaking. I want to trust the Father, I want to abide in the Son, and walk by the Spirit. I do that before conversations, before I speak. Not a bad way to begin, is it? And so I'm desirous for you to do it, not because I think it's something that is nice for you to have, but rather because of what I think it can do for you. And that's why I'm really urging and encouraging you to do that card. That's the one you put by your bedstead if you're not using it, and try it in the morning. And then the other one is Paul's 4 life-changing prayers. Remember where I've told you to put that? Put it on your mirror when you're shaving, whatever you do. We always do the same thing the same way. If you really stop and think about it, we get down to a rut and a routine. We're not even conscious. I think we're in this torpid kind of a internal state that's semi-conscious while we're doing those things. But actually, we can take this card, just read it, and eventually, you know my nefarious plot, I want you to memorize it, of course. And what would be bad about that? My own habit, I have a kind of a funny routine that how I start the day and how I go through certain things that become so much a part of me that I can't not do them. After a while, you become so spring-loaded. And this is one of those things that I find that I have to do in the shower. It's always in the shower I quote these 4. It's funny how a certain thing finds its place and it's in your own life. So please do, I urge you to do this, because my desire for you is for your growth, and tools I think can help us in a busy world. Any kind of tool that I believe can work, and I know it works for me. So it'd be interesting to get some of your testimonies for those of you who have tried using them, because it's very effective. So even if I can train myself before the phone rings, I'm going to trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit while I'm on this call. You see, what you're doing is you're resetting your mind. Well, here we go now to the transcendence of God. So that was just a kind of like a parenthetical thing. But again, the divine transcendence. And I think of a text like Isaiah 57:5. Thus says the high and exalted one, who lives forever, whose name is holy. I dwell on a high and holy place, and also with the contrite and lowly of spirit, in order to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. You see the wonderful combination of both. He's utterly, dazzlingly transcendent on the other one hand, and yet he is concerned. And when we humble ourselves before us and acknowledge our dependence upon him, and that our entire deportment in this day, everything that happens to you, it's going to be up to him. In many ways, we make our plans, but God's the one who introduces all kinds of what we call interruptions, those kairos moments. So he is high, exalted, his name, he lives forever, his name is holy, high and holy place. And so this is an aspect of the divine transcendence. And there are multiple texts that I use. For example, in Handbook to Renewal, I have a little section on Handbook to Renewal about the attributes of God. I use that before I go to sleep. It's another one of my routines. I do it when I'm doing my flossing and my brushing with my little machine. And it works very well. So again, why don't you utilize dead time? And so I like to go through these things, but there's a 3-month cycle, but there's also a renewal guide, topical. And this one deals with the attributes of God. So once again, you can see you are most high over the earth. He is the Lord and most worthy of praise. Just slowly going through a series of texts like this can be very edifying for a person. Bless the Lord, O my soul, you're very great, and you're clothed with splendor and with majesty. And then some other texts that come to mind as well. He is the glory of God, of Israel, does not lie or change his mind. He's not a man that he should change his mind. He doesn't see as man sees. He sees he looks at the heart. Heaven and highest heavens cannot contain you. And so we see that he ordains his plan. He now brings it about. All these things, are you not the God who is in heaven? Something's powerful about reading a series of affirmations about the transcendent wonders of God that is very edifying for your soul. And it does something, especially when you invite the Spirit to kind of bathe that with his presence and make it internalized, make it something a part of you. Because God's interested not in your head knowledge, but in your heart knowledge, you see. You've got to have the knowledge in your mind, surely. He wants us to think well. And in fact, I think all things being equal, the more we renew our minds with the Word of God, the better our minds will work, all things being equal. You'll actually think more clearly because you're thinking God's thoughts after him. But he wants it to go from the mind, to move it from a cognitive apprehension to a personal encounter. And that's really what the Spirit of God does. Mediates truth and takes that truth from the mind and brings it into the heart by way of desire and application. So praying for the grace of holy desire is always a rich and wonderful thing to do. So Tozer then talks about this divine transcendence in this way, and he speaks about it, a new quality of being. And this is why I mentioned this other chart before. There's a new quality of being. When we see him as the one who is we are just part of his creation on the one hand. So as I go back to this little chart again, just by way of reminder, on this level, you're no more significant in this cosmos than a molecule of water as part of the created order. That radical distinction between God and his creation is so profound. But then we move on to, we could call it mineral, to vegetable, to animal, and then human, bottom of, but then raised up, friend, adopted child, friend, lover, so that then we can see. But I've often seen once we embrace God as immanent and close, like a lover, we forget the other fact. And so we need to hold these truths in a balanced tension. He is both terrifying and close. We are to fear him, but also to love him. And that is why these things are so critical for me. So when I think about the fear of God then, again, we've seen this, but here's one way of looking at it then. Surely, at the minimal level, it should evoke a sense of radical humility. What are is there anything you brought to the table on your own? Everything you are and have, your entire disposition, your abilities have been given to you. You didn't choose them. Your wealth, he's the one who gives you the power to make wealth. Your time, all that, and all the relationships, all your skills, it's really derivative from him. So humility means that we look upon him with a sense of dependence upon him, but it can go beyond that to a sense of awe, you see. And so the next level is a sense of a holy awe and an apprehension. And I think that the more God manifests himself, there'll be times in your life where he'll present himself in a slightly less mediated way. You can't begin. If he opened up the veil, we'd be dead. No one can look upon him and live. Not in this life, but thank God in the next, in your resurrected body, you will see him. But not in this life. But yet there's a sense of holy awe that we want to manifest. So it's not just a reverential awe, but it's a kind of a sense of holy awe that can actually then grow even to in some cases into a holy dread. I don't know if you ever experienced that, but there have been times where I've sensed a holy dread about God. But then Tozer goes on to talk about other characters as well, and we'll go back to this chart in a minute, for whom his transcendence was so mysterious and profound. He speaks, for example, of the terror and dismay and the wrenching sensation of sinfulness and guilt. When God spoke, Abram stretched himself upon the ground to listen. When Moses saw the Lord in the burning bush, he hid his face in fear to look upon God. Isaiah's vision of God wrung from him the cry, "Woe is me. I'm undone. I'm disintegrated. I'm torn apart because my eyes have seen you." And yet they really didn't see him, not in his fullness, but it was enough to overwhelm him and make him fall on his face like a dead man. And then he speaks of Daniel's encounter with God. It was probably the most dreadful and wonderful of them all. The prophet lifted up his eyes and saw one whose body was like beryl, and his face, he says, as the appearance of lightning. And this is Daniel 10, 5-9. Let's take a look at that together, because it's just worth remembering. This is the one that we love, and this is the one that we serve as well. So where's my Daniel here? Just a minute here. There we are. Daniel 10. And it's a remarkable text, because he lifted up his eyes. Behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen, whose waist was girded with a belt of pure gold of Uphaz. And so we're looking at an angelic apprehension here. His body was like beryl. His face had the appearance of lightning. His eyes were like flaming torches. His arms and feet were like the gleam of polished bronze. And the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. Now, he's using the word like because he can't describe it. He's at the limit of his vocabulary. It's beyond his words, beyond his description. He's doing the best he can. But how do you describe the ineffable? How do you describe an encounter with one that is so personal, so radical, that you can't really describe it except in the thinnest of terms? He does his best, but in comparison. And so we see this image here, there's words like a sound of a tumult, and he alone saw this vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great dread fell upon them. Reminds me of Saul on the road to Damascus, doesn't it? They had a great dread. They didn't see the vision, but they had a dread of that. And so there was a holy terror again. They ran to hide themselves. Something awful was in this place. So I was left alone and saw this great vision. Yet no strength was left in me, for my natural color turned to a deathly pallor. I retained no strength, but I heard the sound of his words. And as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. And of course, he has to touch him and set him trembling on his hands and knees. This is an angel. We're not talking about the living God. We're talking about something beyond our imagination, but still, it's even more profound than that. So when we consider this amazement of what this looks like, and we consider this vision that Tozer's describing, then going back to where we were before, we're looking at the idea of how his being is utterly different than others. And he mentions a lost child. And what I mean by that is he's describing, imagine you were in a breathtaking place, clouds of breathtaking beauty. All attention's focused upon the earth for a curly-haired little girl, not yet 2 years old, weighing less than 30 pounds. You were looking at the Grand Canyon, all of a sudden we realized this toddler's missing. And for all that grandeur you went to see, suddenly this little child is worth more than all you behold, you see? Because it's a quality of being, and his greatness, his holiness then, has to do with a quality of being that gives it worth. And this, even we see with a child, how much more than the one who made the child. And so the idea, forever God stands apart in light unapproachable. He is as high above an archangel as above a caterpillar. I don't know how that idea came to his mind, but it's not a bad metaphor. Separated from God by infinitude itself. And so this whole idea of knowing him and getting rid of the ceaseless chatter of the busy tribes of men, how much more will we endure this nonsense? And it's even becoming more absurd as we go on. I keep on wanting to, as I look at the culture of our time, wanting to say, Maranatha, our Lord come. But let me use my time that I have for the maximum. Again, I don't want to wring my hands in despair, but I want to say, I'm here for a reason, and you are too. And when we look around us, we see, don't fear what you behold in the hearts of men, even though evil seems to be growing and various cultural forces seem to be being enhanced for various reasons, because I think that God is setting the stage for the next act. And that Jesus said it was going to get worse before it gets better. But nevertheless, my attitude, and I want it to be yours as well, is what can I do with that understanding, that greater understanding of my transitory nature? Let me understand my days, how fleeting they are. How can I use it to the max, is what I'm saying. God's put you in a sphere of influence. He's given you credibility in your vocation, with your neighbors, with your family, your relatives, your friends. And the only point is, he's put those people in your life. He's given you skills. He's given you a life history. He's given you circumstances. And he wants you to creatively use them as you walk in dependence upon him and do your work with excellence. But whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. And so he's saying then that this is a critical theme for us to understand, this whole idea of the glory and greatness of the living God. And so this ends all controversy between man and his God. When you have a little bit of a little hit of that. Now, I didn't go to the fullness because that brings us to what we just talked about. We're talking about holy terror, and those are the examples that he used, although we also have Saul and John in Revelation. So what will it be like when you see him in that context? And so we recognize then that God is both near and far, both close and distant. And so this healing fear, he says, this deep blindness, what you want to do then is to be impressed by his greatness, is the phrase he uses. And I want you to be impressed by his greatness. In fact, I have a little thing I just came up with here that I wanted to share with you here. It has to do with three views here. Three looks. The three looks. You look outwardly and you get distressed. You look inwardly and you're depressed. If you really kind of think without Jesus, it gets worse. You look at Jesus, you are impressed. I want you to be impressed more and more with him. Not the outward circumstances, not the inward roiling and turmoil, but rather be impressed with him. And when he is the one that you are focusing on, thinking about, chewing on, and really processing that as well. As you process him then, as you come to know who he is, you become a person for his own possession. It becomes more real to you. He then talks about, and I won't spend much time on this at all, but God's faithfulness, and he speaks about these facets. But it was interesting to me that in this particular chapter, they're all brief as you know, he chose to focus on the emphasis of seeing all the facets as unitary, because he wanted to emphasize then the essential oneness of all the attributes. His immutability presupposes his faithfulness. And so he's thinking about that then. He says, all of God's acts are consistent with all of his attributes. You don't get to choose and pick one versus another, you see. It's the reaction, being and doing are one. He cannot act out of character with himself. He's at once faithful, but he's also immutable. He's unchanging. He's his own reason for all he does. He cannot be compelled from without. And to magnify any attribute to the exclusion of another is to head straight for one of the dismal swamps of theology, where we're all tempted to do it. What do we want to do? Which ones do we want to focus on? Let's be honest about it. Which ones appeal to us most? It makes perfect sense. That it would in fact be his love, his goodness, his mercy, his faithfulness, things like that. We wouldn't necessarily focus more on his wrath and his holiness, would we, and his justice? But I claim that those are just as true. God's being is unitary. And so last night, just for you, I created a little chart. This is just for you. There it is. I made that for you. And this was an interesting one because these are attributes of God, and I'm trying to say God's being is unitary. Now, you're going to notice that there are three triplets that are the same color. One of them is the omni attributes. They're all green. You see them? Omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence. And then there's another triplet that's the same color. That's what are called the transcendentals, his beauty, his goodness, and his truth. So I just wanted to let you know about that as well. But when you look at, and I find this to be an interesting, I started to kind of chew on this. It's a very interesting thing to process, to meditate on, because it's forcing you to see them all in the simultaneous manner. And that can be a very healthy thing for us to do, to see, because he's faithful then, I can trust him. But his majesty, he's beyond my understanding. So I can't know him. I can't tame him. He's beyond that. But I can love him. I'll never understand him. But he doesn't invite me to understand him. In fact, he says, stop asking me questions of why. Don't ask those questions of why did this happen to me. You're never going to, even if I gave you the answer, you're not ready to receive it. You wouldn't have the capacity to grasp the mysteries within the mysteries, nor can I even begin to have the capacity to grasp how he orchestrates lives and puts them together and causes you to think of a person or being introduced to a person, and he then, behind the scenes, weaves relationships and connections in ways you can never even begin to fathom. This is the one then who holds the cosmos together, and he holds your life. It's a network of relationships, and he holds all those together as well. So we are really absolutely dependent beings. We have to recognize that. And so again, when I've said before that obedience requires both fear of God and trust in him, both sides are true. And so his transcendence, his holiness, the awe, and our response of humility, of brokenness and contrition and trembling at his word, that is as ultimate and absolute as the things that we find a bit more appealing or closer to our grasp, namely his immanence, which means he's close to us, not distant. His goodness, his grace, that he loves us, that we can know him, and that he is present. Yet we can know him, but we can't know him, you see. We only know him to the degree that he's chosen to allow us to know him. And we haven't even scratched the surface yet. That's the amazing part about this. And so I just came up with this other little chart. I gave you a little bit of this before, but I'm going to try it. Did I show this to you before? It's fascinating to me that people are constantly focusing on a little part of our lives. This is your life, you see, right there. And that's the green is when you go into eternity. Now, if we imagine that green was only going to be just this long, and then after that another green, and you're out of here, you're extincted. Okay, would it be would it be worth it if this life, well led, has an impact on the next life, even though it's limited? The answer would be obvious, especially because it's a lot longer. But what's fascinating about this, though, is it keeps on going on. But what's interesting is that most people say that they're at this point in their life, they're having their midlife, they're kind of a crisis of their mortality. You see, oh my gosh, what's happening here? And then they're thinking about their retirement over here, and then they're thinking about what they're going to be doing over here, and they're focusing all their energy on these little things, getting granular about what about my kids and grandkids and this, that, and the other. They're focusing so much of their thought, their energy on these little things as we go through these little stages in life here, that they give almost no attention to this part of life. Very few have an appetite. I want to do a special session with you I'm going to do it with my Wednesday morning group as well, I've decided. I want to do a special session with you on cultivating an appetite for home, because it's more important to me now than ever before. I've got to tell you, it's becoming a very big thing. Because you see, it's really, this is not really what it is. It's really more and more and more and more. It goes on, it matters. And so when you begin to move it down like that, it goes on forever. There's your life. You see your little life down there? Yeah, X marks the spot. You begin to realize your time in this life, if this time in this life has an impact on eternity, then how do we live our lives? We would be foolish to fail to grasp the inevitability of our departure from this world. An inevitability. We have no choice. And for us not to prepare for the next. And so when I think about the God's transcendence, that I can trust him and he's beyond my imagination, but on the other hand, he's faithful, which means he keeps his promises. So when I put my hope in his promises, which are based upon his unchanging character, I'm never going to be disappointed. None of those who put their hope in him will be disappointed. And he keeps his covenant, because God is a covenant maker and keeper. It's the only vision of any God in all of the world religions and so forth, that God is a maker of covenants and a keeper of covenants, because he's a relational being. Remember, a contract is to protect you from another person. A covenant is to commit you to another person. And so when he makes a covenant, even when we're unfaithful, he will be faithful. And that is a good word for us to consider. So ultimately, all these things really do matter. And so given that in your time together, I'd like you to process then these three. What implications might this have for you in your own personal journey? I was sharing with the men on the Zoomies, instead of the roomies. I was sharing with them about this chart, and I started to play with it a little bit, and I made a couple extra copies just then, and it's a rather fun exercise. Suppose you were to just take any two together. So let me randomly just pick this one and this one here. Self-existence and love. I've never thought of connecting those two together. Have you? Have you? That's just, or you could just take, again, randomly, here and here. His grace, but he's incomprehensible. I find it to be an interesting device for me that may be very useful. I can do dyads, but I can also do triads. So let me randomly go here, and then let's just choose this one and that one. So now I have, he's transcendent, he's omnipotent, and he's majestic. It's an interesting combination. So what I'm wanting to do personally is to use this as a kind of a device to zoom in on any ones that I choose to, and think about that. I could even have 4 of the things and process those 4, because God is that way. He's infinite. His possibilities, the combinations, are utterly boundless. And this is only really just scratching the surface. But I'm planning to try this out as a useful meditative tool, because I've never seen. I was going to make a little thing of facets, but I didn't think this circle was what I thought was best. So. Yeah, a lot better than facets, because I love the fact that you can mix them together. But you see no one metaphor, no one image, no one truth. And I believe that there are attributes of God of which we have no knowledge. That He's that deep, that mysterious. I do believe that when we are with Him, and our capacity in our resurrected existence is so radically amplified that it's beyond our current imagination or cognition. When we are in the context of resurrected creation, a new heavens and a new earth, where even time and space now point to the glory of God, not in a fallen sense. When we have no death, no sorrow, sickness, and so forth. When we have boundless creativity and possibilities, what will it be like then when you begin to learn about God? That's when the lesson really begins. I think that's when the true journey, in a way, really begins. You're at the edge of eternity. You're at the brink of eternity. We saw from that little chart how little and how fragmentary our little lives are. Teach us to number our days. Because if you want to be wise, you live with the truth that is what's coming to us. And for me to live as Christ and to die as gain. But why don't we see that as gain? Few do. Few believers see death as gain. And so it's because we don't have a home, a desire. We have to have that homing desire. So this, I hope, will be a tool. But I wonder, what do we discover about God? And not just about the ones that he's going to reveal, but also even with each of these, they will go further and further. Just the grace of God is going to be something that is amplified. I've talked about this before, but it's just coming to my mind here. When I think about the grace of God, and I love to use this because the gap, the yawning gap between us and God is the measure of His grace. But then as we grow and we come to know that God is a lot greater than we thought He was, and sin is a lot worse than we thought it was, we begin to realize His grace is more than we knew, so it continues to grow. I claim that grace, that apprehension, is only going to continue to grow. You're going to become increasingly, forever, more amazed at His greatness and more amazed at the depths to which He went to deliver you and to set you free. That's a wonderful thought. Then perhaps He will deign to reveal new things about Himself that we can't even yet imagine. We don't have the capacity to imagine. And so the more I learn about this created order, if that's an indicator, the more astonished and amazed I become on all levels. What were your thoughts about this whole process, though? Any?
I think one of the things, we were spending a little time in the book of Habakkuk, and the question and answer situation that Habakkuk was going through and questioning God. about things. I think God, and I can't remember the quote, I wrote it down, I wish I could remember it, but I think it's a frustrating and non-productive thing to continue to try to figure out God's plans because we'll never know what those are.
No, yeah,
And I think if we did better our efforts, if we would just focus on the things that we do know about God
yeah,
and allow His control
right.
totally.
Yeah, you're right. And Habakkuk is a great example because he's astonished at the fact that he's raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. So he says, "Why don't you judge them?" He says, "But actually, the fact is, why don't you bring about justice rather in our world?" But now he says, "I'm going to bring the worse people on you." And so wait, that's even worse because to use those people to just judge us, how can that possibly be? So he basically says, is it possible that he's going to do it? And so he says, I'm going to wait. And how can you be just? And then God answers the prophet, as in chapter 2. And having heard that, then something happens remarkably in chapter 3. It's a prayer. And so instead of objecting and saying, I don't get it, why would you use people even worse than us to be our judge? How can that possibly be? How can you be just in doing that? But he says, I heard the report about you and I fear. What is happening is he's had an encounter with God that he didn't have before. And that holy encounter opened up a door of understanding, a portal that he didn't know before. And so he then says his radiance is like the sunlight. And so he describes him, his glory and his greatness. He's looked and startled the nations and so forth. And so he then comes to meditate on the amazement of the one he was objecting to. All these things, sun and moon, everything, the radiance of your so in indignation. And so he heard and his inward parts trembled. Decay in my place I tremble. I must wait quietly for the day of distress. And though but then this incredible affirmation after that debate with God, though the fig tree should not blossom and there be no fruit in the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, what does he say? Yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He has made my feet like hinds' feet. He's making me walk in my high places. And so what is he doing here? He's at the end of the debate then. It's no longer a debate. It's rather a praise, a paean of praise, and saying no matter what happens, no matter what work that'll happen, though all these things happen, I will rejoice in you. That's a change perspective. The circumstances didn't change, but his perspective did. Because the better you know your God, then the better you can understand your circumstances. Because when you have a growing apprehension of the one whose character is unchanging, you will then judge your changing circumstances in light of his unchanging character rather than the other way around. And I think that makes an enormous difference. Was there another thought that you had? Yes.
At the same time, I hear what he's saying, but at the same time, I really believe it's part of that process of going through that debate.
Yes.
That honestly takes you to a place. It's easy to hold it in and look back and say, see, I should have just.
Yes. Good point.
The reality is, it's in the process. That's why Lamentations in the Psalms, I had to go through all that.
Yes. And the Psalms of Lament, the same thing.
Come to the end and say those things.
Yes. So this is not wrong for them to question or wrestle with God. In fact, it would be dishonest if you didn't, because there's a lot of things he allows in your life that make it not a bit of sense. And frankly, you get sometimes angry or depressed or discouraged, don't you? And so then you realize, though, that's why on my stringed instruments, just like the Psalms, he has to add music, because that moves into the deeper realm of the heart and speaks to the roiling emotions beneath the waterline that tell us about things about us that may be wrong. And so the more I have a biblical perspective, I can wrestle with God, but at the end of the day, it is good to wrestle with him, because a faith that's not examined is not a faith that's really worth having. It's got something that you have to process it and wrestle with him. So it's a holy process indeed. Yes.
The problem that I have personally at my age is that I want to know from God, who is omnipotent and all of the other attributes, how are you going to use me, Lord,
Yeah.
when I go to heaven?
Well, that's the question we all want to be asking. How does this life matter? And what is he going to be doing? Remember, endless creative activity without frustration to the glory of God. He's going to be using you and using all your capacities, but he's going to have used your life experience, including your pains. And in fact, your pains and disappointment will shape you and draw you to Jesus more than anything else. And so you become conformed to his death. And then that process, when he is weak, when we're weak, then he is strong. That brokenness we'll discover is actually our glory.